The day we buried my father, two strangers walked into the funeral home and said they were his children. I remember standing there, still holding a damp tissue, still wearing the black dress my mother had ironed that morning. And I looked at these two people, a man and a woman, both older than me, and I thought, I have never seen these faces in my life. My mother went completely still. Not the kind of still that comes from shock. The kind of still that comes from knowing. I didn't understand that yet. I was 26 years old, I had just lost my father, and I was about to find out that the man I buried was not who I thought he was. And neither was my mother. My name is Renee. And this is the story of how my family's entire foundation turned out to be built on a lie that had been carefully maintained for over 30 years. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. My parents, Gerald and Diane, seemed like the most ordinary couple in the world. Dad worked in logistics. Mom taught second grade. On Sundays we went to church. On Friday nights we rented movies and ordered pizza. There were no dramatic fights in our house, no slamming doors, no whispered arguments that stopped when I walked into the room. Or so I thought. What I know now is that ordinary can be a performance. And the most convincing performances are the ones you rehearse for decades. My father died of a heart attack on a Tuesday in March. He was 61 years old. He had complained of chest pressure the Sunday before. My mother told him to call the doctor. He said he would. He didn't. By Wednesday morning he was gone. There was no time to prepare. No time to ask questions. No last conversation. And I have thought about that so many times since then, the things you never say to someone because you assume you will always have more time. The funeral was 3 days later. My mother and I had planned it together, the two of us sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad, choosing hymns and flowers and a casket while the world kept moving outside the window like none of it mattered. About 40 people came. Old friends of my parents, colleagues from my father's work, neighbors, a few relatives from out of state. The service was quiet and dignified. My father would have liked it. And then, just as the director was guiding us toward the reception area, the door opened. A man walked in first. He was tall, dark-coated, maybe 50 years old. Behind him was a woman, slightly younger, with her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. They didn't look like they belonged to anyone in the room. They scanned the space slowly, and then their eyes landed on the framed photograph of my father near the entrance. And something passed over both of their faces. Something I can only describe as grief mixed with something older. Something unresolved. The man walked toward my mother. He said his name. He said, "We're Gerald's children from before." My mother said nothing. She looked at him for a long moment. And then she turned and walked into the next room. I stood there frozen. His children. From before. What did that mean? I followed my mother. I found her standing near the window, her back to the room, one hand pressed flat against the glass. I said, "Mom, who are those people?" She was quiet for so long I thought she hadn't heard me. Then she said, "Not today, Renee, please, not today." And I respected that. Because she had just buried her husband. Because I thought I owed her that much. But inside me something had cracked open. And no matter how many times I tried to push the lid back down over the next few weeks, I couldn't. Because the question was too big. Who were those people? And why did my mother already know the answer? In the weeks after the funeral, I told myself I was giving my mother space. That's what I told myself. But the truth is I was afraid. Afraid of what she might say. Afraid of what it would mean. My mother and I had always been close, or I thought we had been. She was the person I called when I had a bad day. She was the person who knew my coffee order, my fears, my habits. She was supposed to be the one person in my life I didn't have to question. And now I was questioning everything. I went back to my apartment in Columbus. I went back to work. I cooked dinner, did laundry, answered emails. But at night, I would lie awake and replay that moment in the funeral home. The way those two strangers had looked at my father's photograph. The way my mother had gone still. The way she had said, "Not today," like she had already rehearsed the answer for some other day, a day she had always known was coming. 3 weeks after the funeral, I called her. I kept it casual at first. I asked how she was eating, whether the neighbors had been checking in, whether she needed me to come for the weekend. And then, when the conversation had softened, I said it. I said, "Mom, I need you to tell me about those two people at the funeral." The silence was long. Longer than it should have been for someone who claimed not to know what I was talking about. Finally she said, "They were from your father's past, before me, it was a long time ago." I said, "They said they were his children." She said, "I know what they said." I said, "So it's true." Another silence. Then, "Your father had a relationship before we met, there were children from that relationship. He didn't have contact with them, that's all I can tell you." That's all I can tell you. Not that's all there is. Not that's everything. That's all I can tell you. I noticed the difference immediately. I said, "Did you know about them before you married him?" She said, "Renee, I'm not doing this over the phone." I said, "Then I'm coming this weekend." She didn't argue. And that should have told me something right there. Because my mother always argued. She argued about everything, what time I was coming, whether I needed to bring anything, whether I should take the highway or the back road. But this time she just said, "Okay." One word. And I lay awake that whole night turning it over in my mind. I drove to Columbus that Saturday. My mother had made lunch, soup and bread, her default when she was stressed. We ate without talking about it. I waited. After lunch, she sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands folded, and she told me. Or rather, she told me part of it. She said my father had been married before. His first wife's name was Carol. They had married young, in their early 20s. They had 2 children together, Thomas, who was now 52, and Linda, who was 49. My father and Carol had divorced when Thomas was 7 and Linda was 4. After the divorce, my father had relocated to a different city and, according to my mother, had very limited contact with his children from that point on. He met my mother a few years later. They married. They had me. And then, according to my mother, the first family simply faded away. She said it so matter-of-factly. Like they were a chapter that closed. Like 2 human beings, Thomas and Linda, had simply stopped existing when my father decided it was inconvenient to acknowledge them. I sat with that for a long moment. And then I said, "Did they know about me?" She said, "I don't know what your father told them." I said, "Did you ever think about them? Growing up, did it ever occur to you that I had 2 siblings I didn't know about?" She looked out the window. She said, "Your father made his choices, I supported them, that's what a marriage is." I wanted to push. I wanted to ask, is that really what a marriage is? Silence in support of someone else's abandonment. But I held it. Because I could tell she was giving me the shape of the story, not the center of it. And I was starting to understand that the center of it was something else entirely. On the drive home, I kept thinking about Thomas and Linda. 2 people who had grown up without their father. 2 people who had shown up at his funeral as strangers. 2 people who were, technically, my brother and sister. And I had never known they existed. My father had never told me. My mother had never told me. For 26 years, I had been the only child. Except I wasn't. I had never been the only child. I pulled over on the side of the highway and just sat there for a while with the engine running. Because it wasn't just grief anymore. It was something else. It was the slow, nauseating realization that the people who are supposed to tell you the truth about who you are had chosen, deliberately, to tell you a version instead. And I had grown up inside that version, comfortable in it, trusting it. And now the version was starting to come apart at the seams. And I had no idea yet how far it went. I found Thomas on Facebook. It took me less than 10 minutes. His last name was different from mine. He had kept his mother's married name after she remarried, but his profile picture matched the face I had memorized from the funeral home. Same height, same jawline, same eyes. My father's eyes. I stared at the screen for a long time before I did anything. Because once I sent a message, I couldn't unsend it. Once I made contact, there was no going back to the version of my life where I was my father's only child. I sent the message anyway. I said, "Hi Thomas, my name is Renee. I believe we met briefly at Gerald's funeral. I'm his daughter. I think we need to talk." He replied within the hour. He said, "I know who you are. I've known about you for a long time." That sentence stopped me cold. He had known about me for a long time, which meant my father had told him, which meant my father had at some point spoken to Thomas. Despite what my mother had said about limited contact, despite the clear implication that this first family had simply been left behind, my father had been in contact with them, and he had never once mentioned it to me. We arranged a call for the following Tuesday. I didn't tell my mother. I sat in my apartment with a notepad and a glass of water, and I listened to Thomas talk for almost 2 hours. He was careful at first. He chose his words deliberately, like someone who had thought many times about what he would say if this conversation ever happened. He told me that his parents had divorced because their father, my father, had been unfaithful. Not once, multiple times, over the course of years. His mother, Carol, had eventually reached her limit and filed for divorce. His father had not contested it. He had left. And for a while, he had tried to stay in Thomas and Linda's lives. Weekend visits, occasional calls. But then he met someone new. He met my mother. And the visits slowed. The calls became less frequent. And eventually, without any formal announcement, without any real explanation, Gerald, my father, simply stepped back from their lives. Thomas was 11 when the visits stopped completely. Linda was 8. I wrote that down, 11 and 8. Old enough to understand. Old enough to feel it. I asked Thomas, did he ever explain why he stopped coming? Thomas said he sent a letter when I was about 15. He said he had responsibilities now, a new family, that he hoped I'd understand when I was older. A new family. I was the new family. I was the reason he had stopped showing up for the children he already had. I didn't say that out loud, but it sat in my chest like something heavy. I asked him, "You said you knew about me. What did you know?" He said, "He told me about you when you were born. He called. I think he wanted to, I don't know. Maybe he wanted to feel like he had told me, like that made it okay." He paused. He said, "He told me your name. He said you were healthy. He said he hoped someday we might meet." I said, "He never told me about you." Thomas said, "I know." Just 2 words. And somehow that was the most devastating thing he could have said. Because it told me everything about the asymmetry of the situation. Thomas knew my name. He had known it for 26 years. He had carried me in his memory as the sister he never got to meet. And I had spent 26 years not knowing he existed. That imbalance, that specific deliberate imbalance, was my father's doing. He had told one side and hidden everything from the other. And I started to understand why. Because the version of himself he showed to me, the stable, devoted, ordinary father, could not coexist with the version Thomas and Linda knew. Knowing about them would have raised questions. Questions about who he had been before. Questions about what he was capable of. Questions about what he had walked away from. And my father, it seemed, was not a man who wanted to answer those questions. So he had divided his life into compartments. Thomas and Linda in one. Me and my mother in another. It never let the walls come down. I talked to Linda the following week. She was quieter than Thomas. More guarded. She had been 8 years old the last time she saw their father in person, and that 8-year-old was still in her voice when she talked about it. She told me she had spent years trying to understand why he had chosen to leave. She had gone through a period in her 20s of deep depression. She had been in therapy on and off since her teens. She said, "For a long time I thought it was something I did, or something I was. Why else would a parent just stop coming?" I said, "It wasn't you." She said, "I know that now, but knowing it in your head and feeling it are two different things." She was right about that. And I thought about my mother again. My mother who had known there were two children out there, real people, who had grown up without their father because my father had chosen a fresh start. Who had known and said nothing. Who had looked me in the eye for 26 years and never once said, "You have a brother named Thomas and a sister named Linda and they are out there somewhere." Why? Was she protecting me? Was she protecting herself? Or was she protecting the version of my father that she needed to believe in? I didn't know yet. But I was going to find out. Because I had started pulling a thread. And the more I pulled, the more I realized that underneath the ordinary Sunday church Friday pizza surface of my childhood, there was an entirely different story. One my parents had agreed together to keep from me. And the only way to understand what had really happened was to go back further. Much further. Back to before I was born. Back to a woman named Carol. And what she knew. I called Carol. Thomas gave me her number. He warned me she might not want to talk. He said she had spent decades trying to move on. He said she didn't like to revisit that part of her life. But he gave me the number anyway. And she picked up on the second ring. Her voice was steady and careful, the voice of a woman who had learned long ago not to be surprised by difficult things. I told her who I was. She said, "I wondered if this day would ever come." We talked for 3 hours. And Carol told me things about my father and about my mother that I had never imagined. She told me that my father had not simply had affairs during their marriage. She told me that one of those affairs had been with my mother. Diane. The woman who taught second grade and made soup when she was stressed and called me every Sunday and ironed her own dress for her husband's funeral. My mother had been the other woman. She had known my father was married. She had known he had 2 children. She had known all of it. And she had continued the relationship anyway. Carol found out when Linda was 3 years old. She found letters. She confronted my father. He denied it at first. Then he admitted it. He promised to end it. He didn't. A year later, Carol filed for divorce. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, my mother and father were engaged. I sat completely still while Carol told me this. My notepad was in front of me. I hadn't written a single word. I said, "Did my mother know about you and the kids the whole time?" Carol said she knew everything. I actually called her once, early on before the divorce. I called her and told her she was destroying a family, and she told me that Gerald had made his choice. She paused. She said she wasn't cruel about it, I'll give her that. She was very calm. She said she loved him and she believed he loved her and that she was sorry for the pain but that this was between me and Gerald. I thought about the phrase my mother had used at the kitchen table. That's what a marriage is, support. She had said it like wisdom. Like something she had earned. But now I understood where she had learned it. She had learned it by being the person who had broken a different marriage first. I didn't go back to Columbus that weekend. I didn't call my mother. I needed time. I needed to sit with what I now knew and decide what to do with it. Because here is the thing about discovering a truth this large, this layered, it doesn't just change the past. It changes every memory, every Sunday, every pizza night, every I love you and be safe driving in church hymn and iron dress. None of it disappears, but all of it shifts. Because underneath all of it was a choice. A choice my mother had made before I was even born. A choice to be with a man she knew had walked away from 2 small children. A choice to build a life on top of that. And then a choice every day for 26 years to never tell me. I thought about Thomas at 11, waiting for a visit that never came. I thought about Linda at 8, believing she had done something wrong. I thought about Carol calling my mother, asking her to stop. And I thought about my mother, calm and measured on the other end of that line. I thought about all the versions of her I had trusted. Finally, 6 weeks after my conversation with Carol, I drove to Columbus. My mother opened the door before I reached the porch. She looked at my face and she knew. She said, "You talked to them." I said, "I talked to all of them." She stepped back to let me in. We sat in the living room, not the kitchen this time. The kitchen felt too normal for what was about to happen. I told her everything I knew. I said it quietly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. She didn't deny anything. Not one thing. She sat across from me with her hands in her lap, and she confirmed everything Carol had told me. Yes, she had known he was married. Yes, she had known about Thomas and Linda. Yes, she had spoken to Carol. Yes, she had stayed. When I finished, when I had laid out every fact I had learned in the right order like evidence in a case, I looked at her and I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Because I wanted you to love your father the way he deserved to be loved." I said, "The way he deserved, or the way you needed me to?" She flinched. Just slightly. But I saw it. I said, "He had 2 children, Mom. They grew up without him because of choices he made, because of choices you made, and I grew up not knowing any of it. You made that choice too. Every single year you chose to let me believe something that wasn't true." She said, "It was true. Your father loved you. Our family was real." I said, "Our family was built on top of another family, and you just left them there." She didn't answer. There wasn't an answer. I drove home that evening, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my building for a long time. I wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. I was something quieter and harder to name. I was grieving, I think. Not just for my father. For the version of my mother I thought I had. For the uncomplicated love I thought we shared. For the certainty I used to feel. None of it was gone exactly. But it would never be simple again. I kept in touch with Thomas and Linda. Not immediately. Not all at once. But slowly, carefully, the way you build something when you're not sure yet how strong the ground underneath you is. Thomas and I started with emails. He was thoughtful in writing, more relaxed than on the phone. He would share small things, a book he was reading, a trip he had taken, a memory he had of their mother when they were young. And I would share small things back. One afternoon he sent me a photograph. It was an old one, taken in the early 1980s. 2 children sitting on a front porch. Thomas looked about 5. Linda was barely walking, round-faced and squinting into the sun. And there was my father. Young, lean, seated on the porch steps between them. Smiling. I stared at that photograph for a long time. Because he looked happy. He looked present. He looked like a man who loved his children. And he had walked away from that. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if I ever will. My relationship with my mother is different now. Not over. Different. We still talk. We still have lunch when I come to Columbus. She still makes soup. But there is something between us now that wasn't there before, a transparency, uncomfortable and necessary. I asked her once, about a year after everything came out, whether she had ever regretted it. She said, I regret the pain it caused Thomas and Linda. I genuinely do. I said, but not the choice itself. She thought for a moment. She said, I loved your father. I know that doesn't justify everything, but it's the truth. I respected her for that answer. It would have been easy for her to say yes, she regretted it. It would have been the right thing to say. But it wouldn't have been honest. And for the first time in a long time, my mother was being fully honest with me. I learned that honesty and goodness are not always the same thing. That people we love can make choices that are wrong, choices that hurt other people and still be people we love. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. Linda and I talk on the phone every few weeks now. She lives in Michigan, about 4 hours from me. We haven't met in person yet. We're working up to it. She told me once that when she was in her darkest period, in her 20s, she used to imagine what it would be like to have a sister. She said she had given this imaginary sister a name. She said she had imagined what she looked like. She said the imaginary sister was someone she could tell things to. Someone she didn't have to explain herself to, because the sister already knew where she came from. She told me all of this and then she said, and then you messaged Thomas, and it turned out you were real. I didn't know what to say to that. So I didn't say anything. I just let it be what it was. I think about my father differently now. Not worse exactly. More completely. He was a man capable of great love and great selfishness, sometimes at the same time. He was a man who made choices that hurt people, and then built a careful wall so he would never have to look at the damage directly. He was also the man who helped me with my homework and drove me to school when it rained and cried at my college graduation. Both things are true. They always were. I just didn't have all the information. And maybe that's the thing I keep coming back to, not the betrayal itself, not the lies, but the information. The belief that if you are kept in the dark long enough, you will eventually stop questioning the shape of the room you're standing in. You will take the walls as given. You will not ask what's on the other side. My parents built the room. I lived in it comfortably for 26 years. And then 2 strangers walked through the door at a funeral. And I had to learn how to see without the walls. It's not easy. I won't tell you it's easy. Some days it's just sad. Some days I think about 8-year-old Linda asking herself what she did wrong. And I have to put the phone down and go outside for a while. But most days now I am glad I know. I am glad Thomas replied to my message. I am glad Carol picked up the phone. I am glad even for the grief of it, because grief is the price you pay for having loved something real. And my family was real. Just larger than I knew. Just more complicated than I was told. Thomas asked me recently if I was angry at our father. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I said, I think I'm sad for who he could have been, and grateful for who he was to me, and those two things don't cancel each other out. Thomas said, that's the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me about him. I don't know what my father would think if he knew I had found them. I don't know if he would be relieved or afraid. I don't know what he imagined happening after he was gone. But I know this. The secrets he kept cost more than he ever knew. They cost 2 children a father. They cost me 26 years of a truth I deserved. And they cost him the chance to be, in the end, the full version of himself, with all his children, all his mistakes, all the love he was capable of, in the same room at the same time. He never got that. And neither did we. But Thomas and Linda and I, we still have time. And we are using it.